the year 1425, and in the Venetian lagoon, a ship sits idle. Its sails droop in the still air. No anchor is raised, no goods are unloaded, no one comes ashore. The crew paces intermittently. They aren't pirates, smugglers, or fugitives. They're merchants, traders from Alexandria or maybe Constantinople, bringing silks, spices, and stories, but their arrival sparks no welcome. Instead, they wait. By decree of the Venetian health magistrate, any vessel arriving from regions touched by the plague must remain offshore for 40 giorni, 40 days. No exceptions. It doesn't matter if no one's coughing. It doesn't matter if everyone's fine. The clock starts when they drop anchor, and for 40 days, the harbor becomes a holding cell. This isn't punishment, it's policy. Venice is still recovering from the devastation of the Black Death. Memories of mass graves and silent streets linger here like a fog in the alleyway. So, here, just offshore, a crude but revolutionary idea unfolds. Isolation before infection. And on a nearby island, the Lazaretto Vecchio, Venice's new quarantine station, doctors in long robes inspect ships from a distance. They record the days, they observe, and they wait, just like the crew. This is quarantine. Born in a harbor, defined by time, 40 days that mean the difference between contagion and containment. Welcome back to Lexiconned, the podcast where we explore the words we use, the myths that we believe, and the history we never knew we were speaking. I'm your host, TJ, and today we're diving into the story of a word we all came to know too well in recent years, quarantine. Now, the word quarantine comes directly from the Italian phrase 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. It referred to the period that ships were required to remain at anchor before their passengers or crews could disembark during outbreaks of infectious disease, especially the Black Death in the 14th century. Venetian officials, hoping to prevent further spread of plague from port cities, initially required a 30-day isolation, called Trentino. But when that proved insufficient, they extended it to 40 days, 40 giorni. Over time, this evolved in vernacular use into the single term quarantina, then into French as quarantaine, and finally into English by the 17th century as quarantine. Although the word quarantine doesn't appear in English until the early 1600s in reference to both disease control and, curiously, religious penance and mourning. And while the roots are Italian, the concept is even older. Ancient Israelites followed strict isolation rituals for the sick, but the first systematic use of quarantine as a public health tool actually dates to 1377 in the Adriatic port city of Ragusa, or modern-day Dubrovnik, Croatia. You see, they were faced with recurring waves of the Black Death, so Ragusa's governing council issued a decree that all arriving ships and travelers from plague-affected regions must remain in isolation for 30 days, a period then known as Trentino. And if no symptoms emerged during that time, they could proceed into the city. If symptoms developed, well, they were denied entry, or sometimes worse. This pioneering act of public health governance was one of the first written laws of disease containment, based not on superstition, but precaution. It was both radical and pragmatic. And not long after, the Republic of Venice adopted and extended the idea. When 30 days didn't seem long enough to halt transmission, Venetian officials lengthened it to 40 days. And the number 40 was already rich with symbolic meaning and eventually became the new standard. In 1423, Venice established the Lazaretto Vecchio, one of the world's first permanent quarantine stations. It was located on an island in the lagoon, and it was the first time a government institutionalized the idea of isolating the potentially sick, not the known sick, before they could enter society. The 40-day span likely held symbolic significance as well. In Judeo-Christian traditions, the number 40 carries spiritual weight. The flood of Noah lasted 40 days. Moses fasted for 40 days. And Jesus wandered the desert for 40 days. So when Venice enshrined 40 giorni, Into law, it wasn't just epidemiology. It was numerology, theology, and psychology all wrapped into one. Now, in our time, quarantine took on a global relevance during the COVID-19 pandemic, becoming not just a medical term, but a social one. It evolved from policy to punchline, fueling memes, redefining work-from-home culture, and reshaping public discourse on health and freedom. But this wasn't the first time the world tried to outweight a virus. Take Ellis Island, America's famed gateway for over 12 million immigrants between 1892 and 1954. What's less remembered is that just offshore sat Hoffman Island and Swinburne Island, artificial quarantine stations in New York Harbor, where sick or suspected sick passengers could be held before entering the U.S. If even one person aboard a ship showed signs of disease, typhus, smallpox, or cholera, the entire vessel could be detained. Families were sometimes separated for weeks. Detained immigrants underwent medical inspections, fumigations, and sometimes even involuntary treatments. The goal was clear: protect the public, but the effect was often traumatic. Some immigrants, especially from Eastern Europe and the Middle East, described Ellis Island's quarantine as their first experience with institutionalized suspicion. They arrived seeking freedom, but were first met with masks, uniforms, and waiting rooms. And then came 1918. The influenza pandemic, misleadingly dubbed as the Spanish flu, swept across the globe with staggering speed. In just over a year, it infected an estimated 500 million people, killing more than 50 million, or nearly 3% of the world's population at the time. So quarantine was widely used, but unevenly enforced. Cities like St. Louis implemented early aggressive quarantines, closing schools, theaters, and banning public gatherings. But in contrast, Philadelphia, after allowing a war bonds parade to proceed, saw its hospital overwhelmed within days, and the death toll spiked. Many Americans wore gauze masks in public, sometimes by law. Signs in shop windows read, "Wear a mask or go to jail." Railways and ports posted guards. The U.S. Surgeon General urged Americans to avoid crowds and quarantine the cough. But still, the science was rudimentary, and the public was exhausted from World War I. People resisted restrictions. Sound familiar? Well, at its peak, the 1918 flu had soldiers quarantined in barracks, teachers sent home with pay, and entire towns locked down. Some communities, like Gunnison, Colorado, sealed their borders entirely, with armed guards posted at train stations. Quarantine wasn't just a policy. It was a desperate civic ritual, a collective pause where society hoped stillness would stop the spread. Languages worldwide carry this concept. French use quarantaine, Spanish cuarentena, the Arabic quarantina, and Japanese uses kenake, meaning inspection quarantine. Now, each version may reflect a different emphasis, duration, space, or bureaucracy, but the theme is universal: keeping danger at bay. So from ancient ports to modern science, quarantine sits at the intersection of fear, faith, and fact. It's a word born of necessity and shaped by history, linguistically tied to a number that signified not just a length of time, but a belief in healing through patience. And even now, we quarantine ideas, data, emotions, cordoning off what might contaminate in pursuit of something safer. That's it for this episode of Lexiconned. If you enjoyed this socially distant dive into linguistic history, and if you liked the episode, don't forget to like, follow, or share with friends. Thanks for listening and for caring about the words and phrases that shape the world we live in. Stay curious, stay kind, and be well. As always, Lexiconned is written, recorded, and produced by me, your logophile companion, TJ Martin. Sources and additional credits are in the show notes.